The war between the United States and Japan did not begin with explosions over Pearl Harbor. It began years earlier quietly, invisibly inside bank vaults, trade ledgers, shipping manifests, and embargo lists. No soldiers marched, no flags were raised, but by the late 1930s, Japan was already being strangled. In Washington, the conflict did not look like war at all. It looked like policy, regulations, moral posturing, carefully worded sanctions announced from behind polished wooden podiums. The language was clean, legal, bloodless. Japan was an island empire with almost no natural resources of its own. No oil, no rubber, no iron, or in sufficient quantity. Its factories, ships, and armies ran on imported fuel, much of it coming directly from the United States. That dependence was not an accident. It was the result of decades of global economic design. With America positioned at the center of industrial production and financial power, by the 1930s, Japan's economy was growing, but it was fragile. Every battleship launched, every aircraft produced, every mile steamed by the Imperial Navy burned American oil. Every year, Japan paid for survival in dollars. And Washington knew it. As Japan expanded into China, the United States faced a dilemma. Militarily, it was not ready for war. Politically, the public wanted isolation. But economically, America held a weapon more powerful than any fleet. So it used it. Step by step, Washington began tightening the screws. Export restrictions, licensing requirements, quiet pressure on banks, moral condemnations framed as economic necessity. Each move was small enough to seem reasonable. None of them alone justified war. Together, they formed a noose. In Tokyo, leaders understood the danger immediately. Japan could not retreat from China without collapsing politically, but it could not continue expanding without fuel. The empire was being forced into a corner, one where every path led to catastrophe. This was not diplomacy, it was not peace, and it was not yet war. It was something colder, a financial siege designed to break a nation without firing a single shot. And by 1940, Japan's leaders were asking themselves a terrifying question. If the United States controlled Japan's money, its oil, and its trade, then how long before it controlled Japan's future? By the late 1930s, Japan's empire looked formidable on maps. But behind the illusion of power lay a fatal weakness: dependency. Japan could conquer territory. It could defeat armies, but it could not manufacture oil. Nearly 80% of Japan's petroleum came from the United States. The rest came mostly from the Dutch East Indies, whose exports were tightly linked to American and British financial systems. Japan's navy, its pride, its shield, its future floated on foreign fuel. This was not simply a supply issue, it was a strategic choke point. Every Japanese admiral knew the math. Without oil, the fleet would grind to a halt in less than 2 years. Aircraft would sit useless on runways. Training would stop. War plans would rot on paper. And Washington understood this perfectly. American policymakers didn't need to threaten invasion. They didn't need battleships off Tokyo Bay. They had something far more effective: leverage. At first, the pressure was subtle. In 1938, the U.S. government began restricting the export of aviation fuel and high-grade metals, citing national security concerns. Licenses were delayed, shipments slowed, contracts became unpredictable. Japanese buyers noticed something was wrong, but nothing was explicit enough to provoke retaliation. It was economic ambiguity as strategy. Then came the moral framing. As Japan's war in China intensified, Washington shifted the narrative. Trade restrictions were no longer technical matters. They were framed as ethical responses to aggression. American newspapers ran stories of atrocities. Congressional speeches condemned imperial brutality. Public opinion hardened. This was crucial. Any future escalation would need to look defensive, justified, unavoidable. Meanwhile, Japanese officials scrambled. They stockpiled oil. They negotiated desperately with Dutch and British suppliers. They expanded synthetic fuel programs, none of which could meet wartime demand. The more Japan tried to escape dependence, the more obvious it became that escape was impossible. The empire had grown too fast, on foundations it did not control. Inside Japan's leadership, a grim realization spread. The United States was not merely trading with Japan, it was deciding how long Japan could exist as a military power. And unlike tariffs or sanctions of the past, this pressure came with no expiration date, no negotiation timetable, no clear demands. There was no list of conditions to satisfy, no promise of relief, only silence and shrinking reserves. Japan's leaders faced an impossible equation: withdraw from China and risk political collapse at home, or continue and accept economic suffocation from abroad. Either choice meant ruin. And as the months passed, the question stopped being if conflict would come. It became hand-win. What made the US-Japan financial war so dangerous was not its speed, but its deliberate slowness. Washington did not move like a general preparing for battle. It moved like a banker tightening credit. Each step was small enough to appear reasonable. Together, they formed a trap. In 1939, the United States formally terminated its 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. On paper, this meant almost nothing. Trade continued. Ships still sailed. Oil still flowed. But legally, the clock had started ticking. 6 months later, the treaty would expire. And once it did, Washington would be free to impose whatever restrictions it wanted without violating international law. Japan understood the signal immediately. This was not diplomacy, it was a countdown. Inside the Roosevelt administration, strategy meetings increasingly framed Japan not as a trading partner, but as a problem to be managed. The goal was never announced publicly, but internally it was clear. Apply enough economic pressure to force Japan to halt its expansion without firing a shot. Officials believed Japan would eventually blink. They believed Japan's civilian government would override its military. They believed economic pain would translate into political restraint. This assumption would prove fatal. In July 1940, the pressure escalated. The US placed export controls on scrap iron, steel, and aviation fuel materials essential to modern warfare. Again, the language was careful. These were defensive measures, precautions, regulatory adjustments. But Japan's industrial planners saw the truth. Scrap metal wasn't wasted, was the raw material of ships, tanks, and guns. Aviation fuel wasn't optional, it was the future of naval warfare. Each restriction shortened Japan's timeline. By late 1940, Japanese intelligence reports painted a bleak picture. Oil reserves were being consumed faster than anticipated. New supply sources were unreliable. Negotiations dragged on without progress. At the same time, Washington made one thing unmistakably clear: there would be no partial relief. Sanctions would not be eased gradually. There would be no compromise deal. Japan would either abandon its imperial ambitions or face total economic isolation. To American policymakers, this seemed rational, even humane. Better pressure than war. But they misunderstood one critical factor. In Japan's political culture, retreat was not a neutral act. It was humiliation. To withdraw from China under foreign pressure would not stabilize Japan. It would likely collapse the government hand, empower the most extreme factions within the military. Ironically, the more Washington tightened the economic vice, the more it strengthened the voices arguing that only decisive action could save the nation. By the end of 1940, Japan's leadership no longer debated whether the United States was an enemy. They debated whether the enemy would finish the strangulation before Japan acted or after. And once that question took hold, the logic of peace began to unravel. The final rupture came in the summer of 1941. Until that moment, Japan still believed there might be space to maneuver some compromise, some face-saving formula that would allow oil to keep flowing while diplomacy dragged on. That illusion shattered in July. When Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, Washington interpreted it as a direct threat to Southeast Asia's oil lifeline. The response was swift and devastating. President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. On paper, this was not labeled an oil embargo. In practice, it functioned as one. Japanese companies could no longer pay for oil, tankers could no longer load fuel. Contracts became meaningless overnight. Within days, nearly 90% of Japan's oil supply vanished. The strangulation was complete. Inside Tokyo, the shock was immediate. Military planners ran the numbers again and always reached the same conclusion. Japan now had less than 18 months of fuel. Not 18 months of war, 18 months of existence as a modern power. Every sortie flown, every training exercise, every ship at sea burned irreplaceable reserves. Even maintaining readiness was a countdown toward paralysis. Diplomats scrambled. Japan sent envoys to Washington with proposals, partial withdrawals, negotiated timelines, vague promises of restraint. None were accepted. The American position hardened into a single demand: complete withdrawal from China. For Japan's leadership, this was not negotiation. It was surrender. To accept meant admitting that years of bloodshed, sacrifice, and conquest had been for nothing. It meant undermining the military's legitimacy. It meant political implosion, and so the debate inside Japan shifted for the final time. It was no longer about diplomacy. It was about timing. If war was unavoidable, then delay only favored the United States. American industry was vast. Its oil reserves were infinite by comparison. Every month that passed weakened Japan and strengthened its opponent, a decision crystallized. If Japan was going to fight the United States, it had to strike before the fuel ran out, and before American power fully mobilized. The oil embargo did something diplomacy never could. It unified Japan's fractured leadership behind a single grim conclusion. War was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Not because Japan believed it could win a long conflict, but because without war, defeat was guaranteed. The embargo transformed strategic calculation into desperation. It forced Japan into a corner where every rational economic option led to national humiliation. Every irrational military option at least preserved honor. From Washington's perspective, the policy seemed restrained, defensive, even moral. From Tokyo's perspective, it was an ultimatum delivered without words. And once an ultimatum is issued, history has only two paths left: submission or explosion. Once Japan accepted that war with the United States was unavoidable, the problem was no longer whether to strike but where, when, and why. From a purely rational perspective, attacking America made no sense. The United States had a larger population, a stronger industrial base, and access to unlimited natural resources. Every long-term projection ended the same way. Japan would lose, but Japan was not planning a long war. It was planning a shock. Japanese naval doctrine revolved around a single gamble: deliver such a devastating first blow that the United States would lose the will to fight, not defeat fatigue. Negotiation would follow. A settlement would freeze Japan's empire in place before American industry could fully awaken. For this plan to work, one thing had to be removed immediately: the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor was not chosen because it was symbolic. It was chosen because it was operationally decisive. Hawaii sat astride America's Pacific power projection. Battleships, carriers, fuel depots, repair docks, everything that could interfere with Japan's southern expansion flowed through Pearl Harbor. If those assets were destroyed or crippled, Japan believed it would have a window of 6 months to a year to secure oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and fortify a defensive perimeter. Time was the true target. Japanese planners understood they could never conquer America, but they believed they could make war so costly, so shocking, so psychologically traumatic that Washington would choose negotiation over escalation. This belief rested on a dangerous miscalculation. Japan assumed the United States thought like a European power: cautious, interest-driven, transactional. They underestimated something far more volatile: American outrage. The very secrecy and audacity meant to paralyze Washington would instead unify it. Yet from Tokyo's vantage point, the logic still held. Every alternative was worse. Attacking Southeast Asia without neutralizing the U.S. fleet would invite immediate retaliation. Waiting would bleed oil reserves dry. Withdrawing from China would shatter the regime. Pearl Harbor was not madness. It was the final move left on a collapsing chessboard. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, Japanese pilots flew toward Hawaii carrying the weight of years of economic pressure, failed diplomacy, and strategic suffocation. The bombs that fell were not just weapons of war, they were the delayed echo of frozen bank accounts, denied export licenses, and oil contracts turned to dust. Pearl Harbor did not begin the conflict. It revealed it. Pearl Harbor is often remembered as a moment of sudden violence, a surprise attack, a bolt from the blue. But in reality, it was the final symptom of a war that had already been raging for years without gunfire. The United States believed it was using economic pressure as a substitute for war. Japan believed it was being pushed toward extinction as a great power. Both sides believed the other would eventually back down. Both were wrong. Washington misjudged how an authoritarian, honor-bound system responds to strangulation. Economic pain did not weaken Japan's militarists, it validated them. Every embargo strengthened the argument that the West intended to keep Japan permanently subordinate. Tokyo misjudged something even more dangerous. It believed war exhaustion would break American resolve. It believed shock would lead to negotiation. It believed economic logic governed political will. Pearl Harbor destroyed those assumptions in a single morning. Instead of hesitation, it produced unity. Instead of negotiation, it triggered mobilization on an industrial scale the world had never seen. The irony is brutal. The oil embargo that forced Japan into war ultimately ensured Japan would never control oil again. The financial pressure meant to restrain imperial expansion instead accelerated it until it collapsed completely, and the United States learned its own lesson. One that would shape global strategy for decades. Economic weapons are not neutral tools. Sanctions, embargoes, and financial isolation do not pause history, they compress it. They remove off-ramps. They turn slow decline into sudden catastrophe. The US-Japan financial war before Pearl Harbor stands as one of history's clearest warnings. When a nation's survival becomes a ledger problem, leaders stop thinking like accountants and start thinking like gamblers. Pearl Harbor was not inevitable because Japan was aggressive. It was inevitable because every alternative path was quietly closed. This is why the story still matters. In the modern world, wars rarely begin with declarations. They begin with frozen assets, blocked payments, denied access to energy, and invisible pressure applied in conference rooms far from any battlefield. And when leaders convince themselves that economic strangulation is safer than diplomacy, history has shown what comes next, not submission, but eruption. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of the Pacific War. It was the moment the financial war finally ran out of time.